Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lisette Coley, and I'm the Executive Director of Parapsychology Foundation. And on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our President, Mrs. Eileen Coley, I welcome you all here this evening. Now, we're very pleased to have as our speaker tonight, within our Perspectives lectures this evening, Dr. Robert L. Morris. Dr. Morris is a renowned expert in the field of parapsychology. He is currently the Koestler Chair of Parapsychology at the University of Edinburgh, one of the world's most prestigious appointments in the field, and a position that he has held since December 1985. During his time in Edinburgh, he has mentored 14 students to complete PhDs in psychology with dissertations on parapsychology, and is currently supervising several more graduate students. He has published more than 100 articles on parapsychology and is the co-author of 2 books, Foundations of Parapsychology and Guidelines for Testing Psychic Claimants. Lecturing worldwide, he has spoken at most of the major universities in Britain as well as universities around the world, most European countries, and has just returned, I think, from Bali. Yeah, not bad. He was twice elected president of the Parapsychological Association and is currently a vice president of the Society for Psychical Research in London, England. His current research interests include the psychology of deception, volitional competence and performance enhancement, in the psychology of anomalous experiences, and various aspects of parapsychology. He holds a BS in psychology from the University of Pittsburgh and a PhD in psychology from Duke University. Parapsychology Foundation has been very proud to support Dr. Morris's fine work earlier in his career, and we are most proud also of our longtime association and friendship down through the years. So at this point, I'm going to turn you over to Dr. Morris as he speaks tonight to parapsychology in the 21st century, many nations, many perspectives.
Thank you very much. Very pleased and proud to be here, and after that introduction, I can hardly wait to get to know myself. To help you get to know me a little bit, that's us. So email, website. As we move into the 21st century, now is a time when people often do try to stop, take stock, and figure how can we make use of the idea of a turning over of a unit of time for ourselves. How can we have a fresh start which consolidates what's gone on before and builds on it and yet turns in new directions. One kind of topic that I'm sure we're all hearing about, both for better and for worse, is the notion of increased globalization. We are becoming a more global community. Many different societies are getting to know each other better and for worse sometimes. We have much more cross-cultural access to each other, and therefore there can be more cross-cultural tensions of one sort or another, and those tensions, as is often the case, can be either positive or negative. Within and between the different cultures throughout our world is kind of a subculture of academia. And within the different cultures across the world, there are different subcultures within that of academia as well. Academics, university life share certain things in common throughout the world, but also there are crucial and important differences. And so part of what I'd like to do tonight, and this really is a fairly informal series where various of us come in and try to give our perspective on the world of parapsychology. I'm going to try to comment a bit, surveying some of the different kinds of cultural systems throughout the world that I've had a little bit of familiarity with, and try to sort of draw on what's going on in them, what could be going on in them, what potential there might be for telling us more about the phenomena, the experiences, and so on that we normally think about with parapsychology, and also try to take a look a bit, in some cases, at some of the different academic circumstances. Now, I'd like to start, as I gather that many of you are here for the first time, so I'd like to start a little bit then with Scotland. Scotland is nested within the United Kingdom, of course. We have our own football team, which makes us a nation. It just doesn't happen to be in the World Cup right now, so most of my colleagues in Scotland spend their time getting drunk in pubs rooting against England, to no avail apparently. This is the official remit of the Koestler Parapsychology unit. It was established in the early 1980s in the wills of Arthur and Cynthia Koestler. And the formal remit of the whole chair is to conduct systematic and responsible research into the capacity attributed to some individuals to interact with their environments by means other than the recognized sensory and motor channels. Now, that's a pretty broad remit. It gives us a lot of latitude. It means we're studying a capacity attributed to individuals. It means, therefore, that we're studying why people might attribute special abilities to individuals. And of course, as you can imagine, there'd be two major classes or kinds of reasons. They may attribute special abilities to people because people have those special abilities. They may also attribute special abilities to people because they're making a mistake of some sort. They're being deceived by a clever fake or fraud, or they're engaging in some sort of self-deception. Our remit encompasses both. So we are taking a look, if you will, at what's not psychic, but looks like it, as well as the best evidence that we apparently do have access to some truly new means of communication. Those two approaches are not at all incompatible. This is just a rough summary of some of the kinds of different approaches that we're using within our own unit. We're interested in the different kinds of physical factors. What kinds of physical influences may we have access to that might possibly account for any truly new means of communication? How much would present-day physics and biology and psychology actually have to be modified? We're interested in the psychological experience itself. How do individuals interpret and respond to different kinds of exceptional or anomalous experiences suggesting such new means of communication? What conditions seem to be the most conducive for them? What might lead to their expression most? What kind of mental or cognitive processes might be involved? And what are some of the possible psychological explanations? We're also interested in wider views, the social context, if you will. How can views about such phenomena shape science and society? Some of what we do you might regard as the psychology or the philosophy or the sociology of science. We're very interactive with some of the units of sorts that really are interested in the nature of the scientific endeavor. In what ways is it working well? In what ways is it working poorly? If you want to learn about science, often it's a good opportunity to see what does science do when it's confronted with something really exceptional or odd or unusual. Where can we see it working well? Can we see some of its flaws or its difficulties? And then, of course, what are the philosophical implications of such phenomena for metaphysics, for ethics, for the philosophy of the self, for the philosophy of mind, and so on. So it's really a very broad remit. And that fits well in many respects with British and Scottish cultural systems. Within Scotland, as many of you may know, there is the concept or sense of what's often called second sight. And second sight literally is the sense that some people appear now and then to be able to have experiences as though they had almost a parallel system, like a visual system, but something that seems to give them information about remote events and so on. Some of the kinds of Scottish lore even can be fairly dramatic. They have the notion, for instance, of the so-called phantom funeral procession that often on the moors, especially whenever conditions of vision are sort of degraded, the fog is coming in and so on, people will occasionally report encountering a funeral procession where there'll be a set of people carrying aloft a coffin. And by looking at who's carrying the coffin, they will draw an inference as to who would likely be in that coffin. And that serves as a kind of predictor of whether or not a particular person may be near death or at death's door. And according to the lore, according to the legends, now and then, this does seem to be an anticipator of someone dying. or someone having died, but they're in a remote village and people don't know it yet. So there are a lot of vivid traditions like this that are part of, especially in the Highlands, in the Western Isles and so on, and the traditions can often differ from island to island. In the central Scottish belt, that has now become, it's sometimes called Silicon Glen. There's an active academic community there, and they often would have very little in terms of a kind of psychic or parapsychological tradition. Down in the Scottish lowlands, once again, you can get more of a tradition. Throughout Britain, there is a fairly heavy Celtic tradition. There are traditions going back for many years about special abilities, special ways to interact with the environment, and so on. The British scientific community has been at the forefront of certainly certain kinds of advancement of knowledge for many years. Many components of the Enlightenment occurred there. And there is a sense, at least as I've experienced it, of a real openness within the British scientific community. If you will, a sense of true skepticism. Skepticism in both directions. Skeptical of anybody that makes an extremely strong knowledge claim. That they claim that it's all rubbish, people are skeptical of that. That seems premature. Claims that it's all true, that all of the legends and lore are exactly valid and genuine, skepticism about that as well. And so in a way, this is sort of the context within which our chair operates. We've had a fairly decent track record, as Lisette has mentioned. It's actually up to 16 people that have completed their doctorates with us. And this is a rough family tree of past and present United Kingdom parapsychological PhD students. As you can see, there's really quite a lot of them. We've had 16 people complete their doctorates with us so far, and most of them have academic jobs in various places throughout the world. And currently, I have people working for their doctorate with us from Greece, from Cyprus, from Holland, from Portugal, from England, from Scotland, from America, and in the past from countries like Iceland and so on, and we'll probably be adding someone from Taiwan this autumn as well. So it's really quite an interdisciplinary community. Lots of different social systems, lots of different cultural traditions being brought to bear now on this problem. So what we have is a situation in which, certainly in Europe, in the UK, there now are 7 university systems that are looking to form areas of excellence, of expertise in the study of parapsychological, anomalous, exceptional experiences and so on. And so we're starting to form a fair amount of a network. There is activity going on in most European countries right now, each sort of having slightly different shadings in the local tradition. And so within that kind of circumstance, there seems to be a lot of additional activity. Now, what I'd like to do is to comment a bit on some other kinds of cultural or social systems, and then go on to consider some of the areas of potential problem or difficulty with regard to the academic environment and some of the kinds of solutions that we think we have for some of those problems. One major kind of community is the Latin or Ibero-American community. There is a fair amount of activity starting now in Brazil. There are some universities in Brazil that are starting to do coursework in parapsychology. Recently, Ricardo Eppinger completed his doctorate with us, and he's from Curitiba in the southern part of Brazil. Brazil has a very active syncretic tradition of some of the very native traditions, the candomblé and so on, and also a synthesis with some of the teachings of people like Allan Kardec, with Catholicism and so on, many different kinds of social traditions. Northern and southern Portugal, they speak Portuguese, Brazil, are almost even analogous to different kinds of social systems, different kinds of countries, and so on. Within Argentina, there is some activity. There's a couple of different groups there. Also in Mexico, in Puerto Rico. Carlos Alvarado here with the Parapsychological Foundation is the current president of the Ibero-American Parapsychological Association. There is starting to be an increasing activity there. Now, within that general geographic domain, of course, there's feeding in from both Portugal and Spain. And as I mentioned before, both of those countries are starting to have activity. But now nested within this is essentially the British West Indies, and especially Trinidad I'd like to focus on a little bit. And many people don't realize there are a lot of countries there for which English is the first main language, and Trinidad is one of them. Trinidad itself has quite a multiple cultural tradition and a multi-religious tradition. The last figures that I saw within Trinidad had about 45% of Trinidadians could trace their ethnic origins to India, about 38 from Afro-Caribbean destinations, and the rest from Lebanon, Korea, the United States, Europe, and so on. Within some of those traditions, within the Afro-Caribbean tradition, some of those are Christian, some of them are Muslim. Within the India tradition, some of those are Hindu, some of them are Muslim. So there are all kinds of permutations and combinations there. And there is a fairly strong sort of parapsychological tradition there, although it's expressed in slightly different ways from subgroup to subgroup. There is an acceptance of the religious diversity there, although there can be ethnic tensions now and then, and those can sometimes trickle into the political arena. But basically, there is a very great variety of people there. There is an acceptance of the notion of psychic functioning in daily life. It is presumed rather than questioned or challenged. There is also acceptance of the notion that sometimes there is exploitation of this, that there are people that incorporate a kind of psychic element into gambling there in a way that often winds up helping people lose money, just as it does over here, especially people who can't afford to lose the money. Yes. And so this is something that continues as well. One special feature that's kind of interesting about Trinidad is that it has, if you will, a sort of a psychic favorite son. One of their people that was born and raised there, a man named Lalsing Haribans, now known as Sean Haribans, actually lives in the United States now, lives in Houston, Texas. He actually, as near as we can tell, has the most refereed scientific articles in journals and conference proceedings about him of anybody in the world. He's got over 40, and yet he's really not very well known. But he has been working with members of the scientific community in neuropsychology, in cognitive psychology, and so on, and building up some information about some of the unusual circumstances of his experiences and some of his apparent abilities, even under well-controlled circumstances. Because of this, there is an interest in Trinidad in kind of an academic approach, because that's what they already identify with him. And so recently I was there for a visit and to give some talks within the university system there. And there is a real active interest in trying to bring parapsychology onto the campus in Trinidad with the notion that it may well be done in a way that is very special and idiosyncratic to Trinidad. And this is something that is important. And this is something that often happens within academia in various developing countries. As people can say, well, we're developing in a way, we're just getting started, but we've got an opportunity to try to do things specially, uniquely, do something in a way that blends our traditions with other aspects of academia in such a way as to come up with something that people haven't before. One of the elements, for instance, on the campus, in meeting some of the different staff members, was the woman who had just started up their sports science department. And she was herself a Trinidadian Olympic class athlete. And Trinidad has larger than its usual proportion of people who do contribute to world-class athletic performance. And there is a very active tradition of a kind of parapsychological component to much of their competitiveness athletically. And so there, once again, was the sense that perhaps some different things could be brought together to try to understand what is meant by the attribution of a psychic component to athletic performance. How does it fit in with Trinidadian culture? How might we account for it in various different kinds of terms and so on? Is it perhaps a psychological benefit? Is there some true new means of communication going on that may facilitate it, and so on? And so the main idea there was it was an opportunity to try to take a look at something in an additional way. They're also within the Asian communities, within China. Now there is an increased attention being paid to the concept or notion of qi, the idea of a kind of physical energy, but one that is a little bit different than those that we would ordinarily know about. And there is a kind of a different sort of tradition of trying to look within sort of formal ways of scientifically testing things to see whether or not there is evidence for the existence of any kind of energy of this sort. This is linked with some of the interest in parapsychology in Japan. Within Japan, much of it is not academic, much of it is within industry. There are industrial interests. Sony had a couple of parapsychological labs for a while. They're both closed now. There have been personnel from some of the different Japanese companies. The Japanese government now is supporting an association for advances in what they're calling the life sciences. They publish a journal, the ISLIS Journal. Sorry.
I don't mean to interrupt you. Did
Sure,
they
but
do
go
a
ahead.
bunch of research in the 60s also with infrared type of, parapsychol, paranormal events and things like that? In Osaka, Japan, I believe it was.
I'm not familiar with anything in Osaka. Okay. Well, maybe afterwards you can give me a reference on that. I'll look into it. But the idea is that they especially are very interested in a psychophysiological approach. They're very interested in the linkage, if you will, between mind and body. And Japanese manufacturers have been at the forefront of a lot of highly sophisticated equipment in these areas as well. So here in Japan, as well as in China, you see kind of a combination of an increasing orientation towards fairly high technology, but also carrying with them a lot of the earlier cultural traditions. Within Japan, it's often been said, when I was there was a survey taken of people's religiosity. And 80% of the people that were surveyed said that they practiced Buddhism. 80% also said they practiced Shinto, which is the state religion. Only 10% declared themselves to be actually very religious. Practice was the main theme. Social involvement. And within Shinto, there are very different distinct traditions. There's what's called state Shinto, which is the official state religion. And there, at least publicly, there isn't too much discussion of special powers or abilities. Within what's called mountain Shinto, however, by the people in Japan, there is much more of an active tradition. And so if, in fact, one wants to look at where sort of parapsychological phenomena might be occurring in Japan, you go up into the hills a little bit more. You don't spend quite so much of your time in the city. Japan as a society is changing very rapidly. It did have some work by a man named Fukurai around the 1910, 1920. And that then was stopped, and there hadn't been much since. Now, I'll be very interested in what might have gone on in Osaka. Also, within India, there, of course, there is a department of parapsychology and Psychology at Andhra University in Valtaire Province. Dr. Ramakrishna Rao probably is one of the foremost international parapsychologists. And there, of course, you've got the Hindu tradition. You've also increasingly got a very strong high technology tradition within India. Recently, last year, I was there for a conference at the Bombay India Institute of Technology, which is the third-ranked Institute of Technology within all of the Asian community. And there was a very strong interest, especially amongst the undergraduates there, in combining kind of the high technology aspects, especially with computer software and hardware and so on, to trying to find better ways of investigating human experience, the kinds of altered states that many of their traditions and practices would bring to bear on them. As Lisette said, I also just recently spent a bit of time in Indonesia, specifically in Bali. And Bali is one of the islands in the Indonesian archipelago. Indonesia is the fourth most populated country in the world. It's huge in terms of its population. Most of it is Muslim. 95% of Indonesia is Muslim. 95% of Bali is Hindu. It's as though it kind of, as Islam moved across Indonesia, for various reasons, it leaped over Bali. And some of the people who had been Hindu practitioners in Java migrated over to Bali and then stayed there. As of right now, this tradition looks likely to remain. Within Indonesia, I'm told it really is expected that one's religious tradition should be monotheistic, as is Islam. It's one of the three Abrahamic religions. And so Balinese declare themselves to be monotheistic, with one particular one of their pantheon, the one that is perhaps attended to most. However, in terms of daily practice, there is much more of a polytheistic orientation. I was told that most villages in Bali would essentially have groups of people that would be focusing on Vishnu, Brahma, Shiva, and also there generally would be a separate temple for what they refer to as neutral. Because my ears are not so good as I get older, for a while I thought there was a fourth god called Nutra, and finally learned that in fact, no, this meant neutral, which was their way of saying mix and match, a combination of several of the people involved. Within Bali, Indonesian is the dominant language, but you also have Balinese as a special language, which has some very complex customs. English and Dutch also are languages that are spoken there a fair amount. It used to be part of the Dutch East Indies. Within the culture itself, it has had a lot of interest for people who do cross-cultural studies, because it is a very strong example of what's often referred to as a communally oriented culture rather than an individualistically oriented culture. A colleague of mine, Professor Hoyt Edge from Rollins College down in Orlando, is very interested as a philosopher in the concept of the self, the notion of self. And the notion of self is expressed very differently there. For instance, in many of our more individualistically oriented cultures, we might say, this distance is what separates us. And the Balinese would say, this space is what joins us. And there is a constant sense of community. They live. Now, once again, what I'm going to say to you now is a mixture of a bit of my own reading of it and what I experienced doing an all too brief visit there. So those of you that are experts in Bali, please forgive me my naiveties. In general, as near as I can tell, Balinese society was composed of people who all live in compounds. And a compound is roughly a rectangular area that is walled off and contains people within a family living unit. You are born into it, you inherit it. People don't buy and sell compounds. It's a patrilineal society in general, in that when someone gets married, the woman moves to the compound of the man's family. compounds have a very specific structure. Each compound has a shrine area in it, and it's a rectangular area, and that shrine is always located in the part of that rectangle that is closest toward the central sacred mountain of Bali. And in Balinese, you have 4 directions, the equivalent of right and left toward the mountain and away from the mountain. And that is how they orient many different aspects of their life. They essentially practice a kind of Balinese Hinduism very, very strongly throughout most of the daily aspects of their life. Within the large compound that I spent some time, there were a couple of the elder people in the compound who spent most of their time actually making up offering plates. And those offerings would be placed at crucial places in the compound every day as a direct form of interaction to the gods, who all supposedly lived above the central holy mountain. And an enormous amount of their ritual was linked with constant interaction with their deity system. They incorporate the idea of trance and possession into many of their social rituals. While I was there, I was privileged to witness a 6-hour trance ritual that was involved in the healing rituals to help promote the health of a particular village for the next 4 years. And the ritual was largely composed of 2 prepubescent girls who had never done this before, who are selected about a month in advance as people that have shown in terms of their dancing behavior and other behavior as though they are likely to be able to fall readily into trance. They then are worked with for about a month, and at the end of this, they participate in the specific ceremony. That involves certain kind of chanting, different kinds of ritual induction, the inhaling of smoke from certain kinds of incense. And the 2 young girls, generally 12 years old or less, are doing this all side by side. They have their ritual clothing put on, and they start to make ritualistic gestures and do them all pretty much in synchrony. Once they are sufficiently ready, then different people, at least in this ritual from the village, would bring people there who were ill and would present them to the 2 young girls, who by this time were supposedly possessed by gods that were then going to give favors to the village and so on. And there would be about 10 minutes with each individual. This would then go on until there wasn't anybody else in the village left who was offering someone for healing. Then there would be others that would come and make even larger offerings to the gods through these 2 young girls for successful healing in the past. And once again there would be about 10 minutes of ritualistic exchange. Following that, then the young girls would move upright and do a kind of dance oriented throughout the particular shrine where we were, up to 2 chairs that were supported on poles. They would sit in the chairs, and then they would be carried around the village to all the main points of the village and down the main streets, all the while still very much ostensibly in trance, making their synchronized movements and so on. And then will be carried back to a central display area where they would continue to do dance to different kinds of choral music by both sexes, and also to later on gamelan music. While they were being taken around the village, there would be groups of men and women who would alternate chanting by about a minute for each group and so on. This went on for a total of about 6 hours. It culminated in the girls each then going around to everybody that was gathered around in the village, which included ourselves in this case, and giving administrations of holy water to the people, then going around and removing flowers from their headdresses and doing the same thing there. And the main idea behind this was that it was a kind of possession. It was to promote healing in the village, And supposedly the girls were deeply in trance, but still able to coordinate their movements, still able to navigate around without tripping, falling, and so on, and were supposedly able to do the whole thing eyes closed. Now, I wasn't real close to them the whole time, but every time I was close enough, as near as I could tell, their eyes were very tightly closed. Now, we all know that you can kind of have your eyes appear to be very tightly closed and still get, you know, a minimum but usable amount of information. The fact that there was complex chanting going on undoubtedly could have helped in the coordination of their efforts and so on. This experience, the phenomena are not particularly well understood. What certainly seems to be the case is that there is more of a kind of tradition within Balinese culture of entering into different kinds of altered states, doing it readily, and so on. While we were there, we did conduct a study. Professor Edge, as a consultant, an individual there, Dr. Lu Ketut Suryani, who is professor of psychiatry there and head of the psychiatry department at Udani University, the main university in Bali. And she, along with Gordon Jensen, has written a couple of books on transpossession in Bali and is arguing that, in fact, certain components of Balinese psychiatry might be very useful in informing other psychiatric traditions and so on, in terms of understanding what we would call dissociative identity disorder, or what used to be called multiple personality disorder. They are arguing that that shares a lot in common with transpossession, and that many aspects of transpossession essentially are business as usual in certain cultures. Now, there's a long way to go to sort out exactly what may actually be going on here or not. They do have a notion of psychic functioning in daily life, but the notion of people having special powers or abilities, that they would argue is confined very specifically to people that are known as Balian, people that have been trained, that have gone through extensive practice, extensive ritual, that are very actively involved in the religious practice, and also people who seem to have inherited the propensity to have these abilities through their families. When we asked about this, the argument was that it was not genetic, it was more likely to be inherited through the ancestors and so on. So the idea is that they have a fairly active tradition, and they are eager as well to participate in research. Professor Edge had already completed a study in which he was looking at pairs of people, at least one of which had been trained in meditation by Professor Suryani. Part of her work involves training people in meditation, even training people in things like stress management and so on. And she was starting to train people in kind of interactive meditation, so that they were used to meditating together and experiencing a sense of communication then. And so what Professor Edge did was to do a study using pairs of people in which the kind of task was a sort of concentration enhancement procedure. William Broad, several years ago, originated a particular kind of study wherein you have one individual who is trying to focus their attention, as you would if you were concentrating or meditating, simply by focusing on a candle. At the same time, someone else in another room is at random intervals asked to either facilitate or help their concentration, or else leave them alone. Now, the idea is to see, does the participation of that remote person actually have any effect on how well this person can concentrate? How would you assess that or measure it? Well, what they did was to set up an arrangement whereby the person who was trying to concentrate was trained and shown how to press a button every time they felt they were being distracted. So then the question was, did they tend to press the button less frequently when someone was trying to help them? And what Broad found was that, yes, indeed, there was a significant tendency for people to press the button less when someone was trying to help them. Now, in order to be done properly, of course, this had to mean that they were properly blind or unaware of when someone was trying to help them or not. Otherwise, it would simply be self-fulfilling prophecy. It would be simply going along with it. And so we were able to get some success with a procedure like that in our research unit in Scotland. And now Hoyt Edge was able to find significant evidence for it working with the people in Bali. And when we were there, we completed an additional study, which is now being analyzed and assessed and so on, to see whether or not we continue to get this effect. One thing that seemed to be happening this time was that several of the people were reporting that, in fact, at the very start of the session, they felt they had been helped so strongly to enter into a favorable altered state that there really wasn't any point in pressing the button at all. And so in a way that wound up being a draw, if you will. And so this means that in any kind of future work that we do there, we would have to try to modify that design to try to take into account the possibility that some extremely dramatic or strong effects are being found there. Now, I've talked about this a bit just in terms of trying to visit a couple of specimen cultural systems in different parts of the world and talk very briefly about some of the others to indicate that in many different countries now, there is increased academic interest in parapsychology and increased interest in actually working with the various local cultural traditions, and that those are going to differ quite a bit both between countries and also within country. Now, in the second part of this talk, I would like to cover just a little bit some of the potential problems for parapsychology in the 21st century and some of the different kinds of strategies for solving these problems. So it's not really trying to be a bit of a downer here, but there are different kinds of issues that have come up, certainly especially within the academic community, with regard to the presence of parapsychology within an intellectual and academic and institutional context. One of the problem areas is the notion that sometimes parapsychology is regarded as having come from rather problematic metaphysical origins. And sometimes these have been a tendency towards spiritualism or occultism, and people will say that people who are interested in parapsychology obviously are people who do have a very specific kind of belief system or an adherence to a set of practices that they're simply trying to validate. And so one major component of the kind of approach that we try to use at Edinburgh certainly is to take, if you will, a kind of bottom-up approach. Not to be trying to prove or disprove any kind of major philosophical or metaphysical system, but to be saying people seem to have a wide variety of unusual or exceptional experiences. How can we help? How can we take steps to increase our understanding of them? A second kind of problem is that sometimes in the past parapsychological phenomena or effects have been linked to concepts that have been exploited or misused in the past. And here we get into the notion that it often has been big business to claim special powers and abilities. Fakes and frauds have been known literally for several thousand years. On the walls of an ancient tomb, I think about 3,000 years old, was a representation of how to do the cups and the balls trick. Which is something that has amazed and amused people in a wide variety of different societies. So part of what we do, actually, is to try to learn about this rather than just simply worry about it. And so, in fact, some of what we're involved in, and I won't belabor this, is to really try to do different kinds of research on deception itself. So some of our research has been on the production of physical effects. Even back 50 or 60 years ago, a writer named Daryl Fitzke had a very nice organization of essentially close to 50 different ways to make something suddenly appear. comparably about 50 different ways to make something suddenly vanish or disappear, about 45 or 46 ways to make two things transpose or change place, comparably about as many to have one thing transform itself into another, about in the mid-40s of different ways to make something appear to be destroyed and then returned again, healed again, returned to its former state. Almost 60 different ways of anomalous penetration. The knife goes in and then it comes out again and so on. Slightly fewer ways, I think only 13 different ways to levitate. Only about 8 or 9 different ways to simulate anomalous attraction and so on. The idea is that there have been a lot of different kinds of ways of producing physical effects. The magic community is starting to open up now. One of my full-time colleagues now is a former president of the Edinburgh Magic Circle. One of the people who got his PhDs from me a few years ago, at one time was the youngest associate of the British Magic Circle. And these are very highly skilled close-up magicians. And we are now trying to start to study and learn more about the psychology behind what they do, even some of the physics behind what they do, and so on. There are different kinds of mental effects, psychic powers, other kinds of mental abilities that have been simulated that we're trying to study. The strategies for presenting information to observers, the strategies for negotiating, how you're going to have your performance evaluated, different kinds of psychic reading techniques. There's many different kinds of techniques that fake psychics will use to persuade you they know all about you. We've got books this thick on how to be a fake tarot card reader. Now that doesn't mean there's no such thing as a real tarot card reader, I hasten to add, but we now know a lot about how to fake it. Books only about this thick on how to be a fake mail order psychic. And it's really very effective. It's big business. And people who practice this are now writing more about it, and we're starting to try to understand the themes behind it. Confidence artists, some people are very poor fakes and frauds, but they're wonderful at gaining your confidence. Evaluating archival material, how do we go back and evaluate people writing up the miracles of the past? The socio-cultural context of deception, developing different kinds of models of it, and so on. So this is all just simply to say we've become pretty active in this area, and it is one of the ways to try to address a bit some of the problems involved in the fact that people complain that there have been fakes and frauds in the past, and continue to be. But a major part of the effort is how to separate out those that are essentially fooling you and those that may have some genuine abilities. Another problem, in addition to my own losing of my own overheads, is that sometimes parapsychology can be easily linked with psychotic belief systems, or at least so it is claimed. And there are many people within the healthcare delivery systems that are quite worried about whether or not parapsychology colludes with dysfunctional belief systems. Now obviously, just because you think you may have some psychic ability doesn't mean that you have any kind of psychological difficulty. There's a lot more to it than that, and often even people who hear voices will be people that will report the voices are friendly, supportive, give them good advice, function as their friends, and there's no way they want the voices to stop. On the other hand, as we know, hearing voices is one of the major presenting symptoms of some very difficult kinds of delusional systems, including certain forms of schizophrenia and so on. But even there, sometimes people get institutionalized when they have real difficulty in hearing voices. There are drugs that will make some of the voices go away. There are some people that are very resistant to the drugs. Sometimes there's been success there with creating systems that will give like muscle biofeedback. And whenever people are hearing voices, there's a tendency for them to be making small muscle movements in their throat. Also, there are certain parts of their brain in the prefrontal areas that are more likely to light up and show exceptional activity whenever they report hearing voices. So we are starting to build up a picture from a neuropsychological standpoint of at least some contribution to why some people hear voices and some don't. There is also something called the Hearing Voices Network that was started in Holland. I don't know how much it's active here in the States, but certainly throughout Europe, there are local chapters, and these are people who hear voices but are not institutionalized. And they're somewhat like Alcoholics Anonymous. They're people who will gather together and exchange advice or tips on how to manage the voices. And it's very interesting. There are people that have made a bargain with their voices to talk to them mostly between 7 and 9 at night, and to shut up after that because it's time for me to go to bed and I have to be at work before then. Who knows what's actually going on inside people at that time? But the main point here is that we are trying to have a fair amount of interaction with the clinical training community. We do have a local clinical psychologist and a network of them that we can refer people to who contact us having trouble with their experiences. And each and every one of these people are people that are open to genuine new means of communication. And so they're able to try to really listen to the accounts of people who seem to be having difficulties with their experiences. We're now part of the training of people in clinical psychology at the University of Edinburgh. And many of the things they're interested in are cultural differences in the norms for experiences. There are people who move from one society into another and have no idea what's normal for that society, and often they will label something as delusional even though it's actually business as usual for that society. Britain itself is becoming much more of a multicultural society now. Britain is now 5% Muslim. And so there are many people coming in from different religious traditions, bringing in experiences, expectations, and so on. And you've got to have a good mix there. Different ways of looking at how we acquire beliefs, looking at how people can attribute meaning to the experiences they have, maybe even in some cases using cognitive intervention strategies for people that are having trouble with some of their experiences, to understand some of the different ways that you can alternatively interpret your experiences, and so on. I won't go into all the details of this now, but if any of you are interested, then email us and we can give you more literature on this topic. But one way or another, the idea is that rather than ignoring or just simply being concerned about the fact that sometimes there seems to be linkage with psychotic belief systems, for us to really try to understand what is going on. Do we often mislabel people as being psychotic? Are there people that oftentimes are even institutionalized who simply are having difficulty in coping with sets of exceptional experiences without having to have the label of psychosis put on them? In Britain, once, for instance, you get labeled as schizophrenic, then you can't get a mortgage on a house. There are different things that you really are prevented from doing. And if, in fact, you've been mislabeled, then things are not going very well for you. A few other things. Parapsychology can threaten sometimes the tidiness of our scientific methodology. Frankly, one of the things that sometimes happens is that researchers often can feel, well, I don't know whether there's anything to psychic phenomena or not. I hope there isn't, because if there is, it's going to make all my research a lot harder to do. You know, I've now got to take into account a lot more things, and that's going to complicate my life. And so many of them even, have been quite candid in admitting, well, I don't know if there's anything to what you're doing. I sure hope there isn't, because my world will become much more complicated. I won't be able to interpret all of my nice tidy meter readings in the same way again. And so here, part of it is we're trying really to take a look at the implications of what we do for the notion of scientific practice, to try to take what you might call a systems approach to any kind of research investigation, to see whether or not there is anything to their worries or concerns and so on. The more we learn, one of my students is especially focusing on how researchers deal with anomalies in their own areas. And one of the things that certainly is emerging is that a lot of researchers deal with them very conveniently. They sweep them under the rug. They ignore them. There are even statistical techniques for processing something called outliers. And if you've got an outlier, you simply now have very good mathematical techniques for justifying its exclusion from your data. Now, that's fine for some purposes, but as you can imagine, that's going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's one of the things that is a very powerful constraining force on the nature of the scientific endeavor itself. And that's kind of one of the take-home messages of this, is that we feel that in the 21st century, by really getting into exploring very richly exceptional or unusual or anomalous experience and so on, we may be able to be pushing the scientific community to be much more accountable than it has been in the past. It's obviously succeeded fantastically at many things, but sometimes it's not doing too well whenever it really is confronting anomaly or the exceptional. Time and again, whenever a breakthrough or a discovery has been made, even with things like chimpanzee communication, whenever the extensive use of sign language in chimpanzees and the ease with which you can train them in this was uncovered, there were chimpanzee communication researchers who were sort of slapping their head and going back and looking at the film of their chimpanzees before and saying, we had the clues in the past that this would have been viable, but we ignored them because we had our own agenda. Parapsychology can force us to examine theoretical concepts that science has found to be problematic. That's just a fancy way of saying, because of the fact we're studying exceptional or unusual experience, we are focusing again on experience, on the nature of consciousness, on the nature of different kinds of states of awareness, on the nature of different kinds of special talents and abilities and so on. Science, believe it or not, in psychology, when it was first getting started, the idea of volition or will or willpower was a very central concept. And if you think of it, we use that kind of concept in our daily language all the time. But it disappeared thanks to the onset of behaviorism and is only recently now returning in different schools of psychology. They call it a more systematic study of what you might call volitional skills or volitional competence. A lot of it is involved in sports psychology now, which is another one of the connections that we're making. Okay, yeah. Yeah, because I'm almost done here. Yeah, and one of the things, the whole idea of volition or intention or striving is very important in parapsychology, because if you think of it, a lot of people's unusual or exceptional experiences are spontaneous. They happen unintended. You had a dream and then the next day it turned out to have some resemblance to what turned out to be the case. You weren't intending to do it. On the other hand, sometimes in the real world, or especially in research conditions, we ask people, now please come in between 4 and 4:30 and intend to be psychic next Tuesday. Well, if it were that easy, we'd have known all about it a long time ago. So it isn't. So part of what we have to do, and it's the same in any kind of study of performance enhancement, is to try to say, what's the difference whenever you try? What about trying too hard? Almost any area of human performance involves the notion that you can try too hard. And especially if somebody says, I'm going to try to be psychic now, what are you going to do upstairs? You know, what's actually going to happen here? And there are various techniques that have been evolved. There are different kinds of training techniques and so on. And so part of what we're trying to do is to explore some of those different sorts of training techniques, which is not easy. It's longitudinal work. But also try to understand more the whole concept or notion of volitional competence, volitional skills. There are different people now exploring a lot more the kinds of strategies that are used. I mean, from my standpoint, if I'm watching the Olympics, the gymnast who gets the gold medal from me would be the one who gets halfway through her routine on the balance beam, falls off, and then gets back up on again and completes a perfect routine. That is far more challenging emotionally, mentally, physically than the person who does flip, 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 and it's really very nice. And so what is it about some people and some circumstances that mean we can rise to the challenge? There are some real surprises here, and it's a very rich area of human experience. And this also focuses on one other thing. In other words, parapsychology right now is really sort of, I hope and think, forcing different kinds of disciplines like psychology to confront its own subject matter much, much more richly than it has before. Psychologists often, and I speak this as one of them, are very analogous to the old Tales of Nasruddin fable, where the mullah was walking along and saw a man down on his hands and knees underneath a street lamp. And the mullah came up and said, "Can I help you?" And the fellow said, "Yes, I lost my ring." And the mullah got down on his hands and knees and looked around, and after about 10 minutes when they couldn't find the ring, the mullah said, "Well, you know, we're having trouble here. Where exactly did you lose the ring?" And the man said, "Well, I lost it over in the bushes." And the mullah said, "Why are we looking here under the street lamp?" And the answer was, of course, because the light is brighter. So that on the one hand is a joke. On the other hand, it is so typical of a lot of our endeavors. In other words, many disciplines look where the light is brightest, not necessarily where they might expect to find the richest phenomena, the richest experience, and so on. And this is something that we've really got to get over. Parapsychology can threaten fixed beliefs about how the world works. Well, that's no surprise. Basically, part of what we're doing is increasing a little bit of uncertainty for a while. And if you might say, we're sort of gently and politely, hopefully, querying any system which says we now know exactly the way the world works. Well, my own feeling is that our knowledge of the way the world works is woefully incomplete, and that we need to really try to explore things much, much more richly. And that's true of somebody who has a metaphysical stroke theological orientation, or somebody who has a materialist scientific orientation. In both cases, we often will find people rushing to judgment. You know, many of us, it's natural. We would like to have the feeling that we know exactly how the world works. And we've learned a lot, but I really think there's a lot of validity to the notion that the more you know you don't know. Parapsychological research can raise ethical issues. This is really a very interesting one as well, because the whole notion of parapsychology is fraught with a lot of ethical issues and concerns and so on. If you think about psychic functioning, you can see that there's a lot of room for potential distress here. In addition to some of the notions that we've covered before, there is the idea that oftentimes unusual or exceptional experiences can be frightening in and of themselves. There are cultures, including some of the Scottish cultures, that would regard acquiring or having psychic ability as a bit of a curse. And up in the Highlands, they would say, we certainly believe in psychic functioning. No, we would not like to be trained in its usage, because as near as we can tell, it primarily brings bad news. You know, you're not very good. You know, when people get psychic impressions, it generally tends to have kind of a warning or a premonitory notion, or something that may help to increase the health and safety of the people involved. You rarely are psychically tuning in on somebody having a terrific time. You know, there aren't that many anecdotes of that. I mean, there are some, but there are a set of ethical issues there. Anything that talks about training then is talking about change. Charlie Tart has often talked about what he calls the psychic pill. And he says, now pretend this is a psychic pill. If you take it, you will become irrevocably psychic. Would you really take the pill? You know, and spend a little time thinking about your answer. You know, and certainly some people would take the pill, but a lot of people would say, well, certainly not yet, and maybe not for quite some time. So this means then, in a way, that a lot of the work that we do has to try to take into account the ethical considerations, certainly of our research participants, of the people that we interact with, and so on. And this also is not particularly easy. When I first taught a full-time course in parapsychology at a major university, one individual in my class had a little bit of a breakdown, and thought that I and a couple of other people on the staff were sending psychic messages to her all the time. Well, we had a conversation about it, and she wasn't really too far into it yet. And it turned out gradually, as she became more and more convinced that I was trying to be very genuine with her, and it turned out that she was just a first-year student at Southern California University. She had just started taking drugs. She was taking them under circumstances in which she wasn't really learning what she was doing, and she was starting to have flashbacks at different times. And once that became evident, then she was able to go to the counseling center, and they were able to set a better context. She was able to say, well, okay, I understand what's going on now. But for a while there, I thought, is it really ethically okay even to teach a course about parapsychology on campus? And for a while, I was thinking maybe it's not a good idea. But the problem got solved because I realized that was the only time I taught the course where I had led off with its historical introductions, which seemed like a natural thing to do, and had gotten quite some distance into the course before I started talking about what's not psychic but looks like it. I now, in any public lecture, generally would tend to spend about the first third of it talking about what's not psychic but looks like it, so that there is more of a context said there, that in fact there are both sides to the coin and so on. That if just because you have some very powerful experiences may not in and of itself mean that you have any kind of special abilities. You may or may not, but by all means try to be open to some of the different alternatives. Many of the kinds of studies we might most like to do would be ones that we would be ethically forbidden to do, which means we would not like to do them. If you look at a lot of the anecdotal material, some of the strongest anecdotes involve people responding to other people in a large amount of trouble, sometimes even death. Well, we're not, I mean, we've had people volunteer their close relatives to be gotten into intense trouble, but we'd rather not do that. And so we've thought even about ways of getting people like method actors to simulate and so on, or doing certain things with ourselves, or somehow approximating things. So the kinds of things we might want to do to produce, very strong, consistent results of the sort that might then let us try to understand how it works very meaningfully, we really have a lot of problems to solve here, and I won't pretend that we've made a huge amount of progress on this. Parapsychology involves the study of complicated open systems. We've been especially trying to focus on this. If in fact you say we're open to the notion of some new means of communication, well, where do you draw the boundary then? Many systems are what are called open systems. It means that you can't essentially draw a firm boundary on everybody that's involved. Often somebody will have an experience and will then claim, well, I was the psychic person. But it may well be that they weren't the psychic person or the only psychic person, that there may be larger systems involved. Even in attempts at well-controlled research, we now have experimenter effects and situations where it may be that the researcher is not able to stand back from their data gathering in the way that one might otherwise have thought. Some of our researchers are much better at getting results than others. That may be because they have better sight manner. It may be because they are themselves sort of parapsychologically involved in some way in the production of the data. So this is something that is coming to be a problem with a lot of areas of research as well. There's much more of an orientation now towards taking a system approach in various aspects of science and getting away from some of the nice, tidy, linear models of research that have been done before. Parapsychology has difficulty in generating and testing theory-based hypotheses. Well, why wouldn't it? Because of all these other problems and so on. There are richer attempts now within new domains of theoretical physics to try to account for psychic functioning. There are more people from the physics community exploring the theoretical edges of physics and looking for ways to link them up with parapsychological phenomena. Also as people trying to understand, sort of human mind, human brain functioning and so on. These are ideas and topics of considerable interest to us. We still don't even understand mind-body linkages. We still don't have a clue about the nature of consciousness, despite people like Dennett, who write books with lovely titles called Consciousness Explained. Sooner or later, he gets around to saying, but of course, you don't expect me to actually account for it. And there are people like Chalmers who talk about the so-called hard problem. If you're interested in this, once again, get in touch with us because there are some very interesting readings now on some of the real problems in trying to understand the nature of consciousness, the nature of experience itself. And finally, parapsychology has often been labeled a pseudoscience. And this once again gets us back into the study of the nature of science and why people attribute pseudoscientific practice to some things than others. Sometimes people may practice bad science. We've certainly seen people practice get into scientific studies and parapsychology where they've not done quite such a good job. We also are aware of very comparable practices within the so-called skeptical community. There can be pseudo-criticism, pseudo-skepticism, as well as bad criticism, bad skepticism, and so on. So there's a lot of work to be done in this respect as well. So really, these are kind of the two interlocking things that I wanted to raise for you and discuss with you tonight. On the one hand, within the 21st century, a lot of involvement by a variety of different social-cultural systems and a lot of involvement by their attendant academic and intellectual communities. And also that parapsychology does have some problems in terms of establishing itself in an academic environment, but there are ways of trying to address and solve those problems that I think will be even more richly explored in this next century. So thank you for your attention. I'm fine for questions and things. Yes, sir?
What's the estimated proportion of students and practitioners and scientists in the field of parapsychology who are themselves, who regard themselves, or I guess who are, or who others think they are, sensitives or gifted people, you say?
I've seen a figure of about 10% cited on that, but I don't have a reference for it. And bear in mind, once again, that many people might be less inclined to dichotomize and say, you know, I am asensitive versus not. If you were to say how many people in the field would say, yes, indeed, I feel I've shown some evidence of psychic functioning now and then, you know, you'd have a much higher figure than that, you know, well over 50%. There are, of course, some people that say, well, I've studied it all my life and I've never had a single psychic experience. You know, those would tend to be the exception more than the rule. Yes, ma'am.
What's happening academically in this country? Very little?
Well, in a way,
Mention it.
no, I didn't, did I?
And
No,
it's
I didn't
really
talk.
important tonight, so.
Well, I've been out of this country. I've been having an out-of-the-country experience for about 16 years now. But as near as I can tell, two kinds of things are happening. There are people doing research more in institutions, in institutes, than in academia. And secondly, a lot of people are just not using the word parapsychology anymore.
What do you call it?
Well, there's a lot of euphemisms that are used. There's a lot of work being done in complementary medicine now. And they may, for instance, just simply talk about remote healing. And so it's remote, you know. And so they say, okay, well, here's an effect. You know, the healer happens to be way over there. And oftentimes there, they are coming at it from the bottom up and saying, here's an effect of some sort. And we're not going to call it parapsychology. And they avoid, you know, the attendant terms, ESP, PK, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition. And, you know, we have colleagues who do not like to use those terms at all. When I was back in this country at Syracuse University, we were the Communication Studies Laboratory, and we were part of the School of Computer and Information Science. And then I went over, the reason we're the chair of parapsychology is because Arthur and Cynthia put it in their will, you know. And, you know, I shouldn't say, you know, I mean, a term is a term. And so what we have been able to do, in part, is to try to help shape a public construence of parapsychology as something that is more academically responsible. Britain's a smaller country. The media are more interested in the sex lives of politicians and, you know, royals.
Unlike here.
Unlike here, yeah. Unlike here. Well, yeah, you know, it's...
I'm kidding.
Yeah. There are, I think, some universities that offer courses, but also you've got a stronger skeptics organization here. The PsyCop people here are extremely well organized, very heavily funded, a lot of their funding from the entertainment industry. And in the UK, we're fine with the local skeptics group. You know, we have a standing invitation, you know, to publish in their articles and so on, and they also, from our standpoint, are kind of nicer people too.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, there's lots of things. Yes, sir.
On the
you had
BBC
the thing.
Radio, a Cambridge University professor of physics has stepped forward and endorsed the paranormal. So I don't remember his name.
Yeah, Brian Josephson. Yeah, he's a Nobel laureate. He got it for the Josephson Junction a long time ago.
It's
So.
like he said, it's slowly, you know,
Right, and
more
that's in
scientists are
Britain.
stepping
Britain has
forward.
a long history of being open to this.
Well, one thing that I don't know that much about is what role strong religious fundamentalism does or does not play. We don't have much of it in Britain. You know, for better or for worse. I make no judgment about that.
Makes a big difference.
But,
How does it break down politically?
sorry?
How does it break down politically? Do you have any reading on that? I mean, conservative versus liberal? And
Most people that I know of that claim they have done readings for people in the government would claim that it cuts across the political spectrum. And certainly, including in this country. You know, that people are interested, if they are politically motivated, they are interested in whatever kind of information they can get. And they generally would not rely exclusively on a psychic. They would say, see, how much do you complement the other information I have access to? And often they may even say, I don't even care if you're genuinely psychic. You apparently are pretty good at something. So, you know, tell me about myself. You know, do a reading for me. You know, I've met at least one person who claims to have done a reading for about, 2/3 of the members of Congress. You know, but that's a claim, and this person may have lots of reasons to make that claim. But yes, I don't get the feeling that it is tied into a particular political view. We do know, of course, in the past in geopolitics, probably the stunning example was Nazi Germany.
Hitler and Reagan?
That's right. Yeah. So, there has been that connection made. But I don't think, I also have known of some politicians in this country that I would say are much more on the liberal, end of the spectrum as well. So, I don't see a consistent relationship there. Yes, sir, in the back.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, was there a specific event that came about, that brought about your interest in the subject? That's how you,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and if you could discuss that a little bit.
Right. Somehow I knew that was going to be the next question.
Yeah, I know that too.
Yeah, it's...
And the other question is, as you mentioned the ethical issues where you yourself are somewhat concerned because of what can happen in a classroom, where do people who are interested in the subject, or wherever it might be in an academic setting, or they're experiencing these type of things, where do people go to interact? People generally who are interested, maybe they'll get ripped off and go to a fake psychic, or read the horoscopes in the newspaper. But is there a place where people actually go that has some level of credibility?
Yes.
Other than this
Yes.
library.
Other than this library.
Is this where it starts and is this where it ends?
No, it's not where it starts and ends. This is a wonderful library. It's one of the best in the world. Yep. And there's some of the different societies. The Parapsychology Foundation really is quite interested in and concerned now to be developing far better ways of communicating useful information to the public. That's even why they're holding events like this. And this, I'm told, is a larger attendance than has traditionally been the case, and probably that will continue to be so because now there is, the PF now has a larger web presence. And frankly, that is one of the things, for better and for worse, that a lot of people are turning to. A lot of people who want information go to the web now. And you can get good information on the web and you can get rotten information on the web. And so part of the effort really is to try to find better ways of conveying to people, what we really know and what we don't know, in a way that both is interesting and entertaining, and yet doesn't lose sight of what we know and what we don't know. Because sometimes there can seem to be a kind of dumbing down, or there can be something where you simplify things enough so that you lose the richness of the actual content and so on. But people are really interested in this topic, and I think they want to know, what is the current state of play? What do we know and what we don't know? So yes, indeed, this is a major place. They're on the web. They are linked to other networks and so on. There's the Institute for Parapsychology, well, it used to be that, the Rhine Research Center down in North Carolina that has a summer studies program for a couple of months. That is a fairly intensive program. There's the American Society for Psychical Research on the other side of the park. There's you know, other smaller units here and there. There is a Parapsychological Association that is our professional organization. It's associated with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It's an affiliate and so on.
Where do you put the Edgar Cayce bunch?
I used to know some of the people involved with them when I was here. I know they also have a fairly sizable library. There it's a matter of what they are doing right now. There's also something called the Atlantic University that has been associated with them, that Doug Richards has been connected with, I believe. And I really don't know that much about where they are right now. You know, I have been kind of out of it a little bit in this country for about 16 years now. Just addressing the other thing you said, I was like most kids, and liked stories of the unusual when I was young. But when I was about 12 or 13 years old, I was helping my parents clean out a closet, and I found an aluminum box in the back that had 25 colored marbles in it. And I said to my parents, "What is this?" And without going into details of the mechanism of it and so on, well, they said, "This is a device we had built for us before you were born. That is an ESP and PK testing device." It basically had to do with whether you could guess or influence the colored marble that was going to fall down a chute next. And so I played around with it, as you do, and said to my parents, "Are these things real?" And they said, "Well, we think so, but we don't know." And so then I said, "Well, why don't you know?" And they said, "Well, as near as, science doesn't know." "Well, why doesn't science know?" "Well, because as near as we can tell, they're ignoring it." And so that was the simple, crude message from my parents that got me hooked on all of this. Was not to try to confirm or disconfirm a belief. It was to say, my goodness, this seems to be an incredibly important part of human experience. Let's not ignore it. And this is what...
Or not. If it's no basis.
Exactly, that's right. Either way, this is an incredibly important part of human experience. Let's try to understand what's going on there. If there's nothing to it, isn't that extremely important to get tidied over and not just superficially asserted, as though on high? And that means a lot of work to be done. And conversely, of course, if there is something to at least some of the claims, then we must know about that, because otherwise our knowledge of ourselves is woefully incomplete. So either way, we are unfinished business. And if in fact researchers ignore this area, then they essentially stand away from the stage and yield the floor to people that will come in and try to sell them a bill of goods one way or the other. So that's why we really have to get people much more involved.
Hi there, I'm Lisette Coley. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation, so welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.